For most audiences, Frank Lucas exists as a symbol, not a person. He is remembered as the American Gangster, a man portrayed as a logistics mastermind, a criminal who supposedly outsmarted the Mafia, bypassed the system, and built a heroin empire through intelligence and fearlessness alone. Hollywood presents him as the ultimate outsider who broke every rule and still won. A self-made king who controlled supply lines stretching from Southeast Asia to Harlem, cutting out middlemen and humiliating older power structures. This version of the story is clean, dramatic, and easy to admire because it reduces an entire criminal economy into one commanding figure. But legends like this do not emerge because they are accurate. They emerge because they are useful. They give complex systems a face. They turn corruption into character, and they allow institutions to disappear quietly into the background. The moment we slow down and examine the logic, the myth begins to fracture. How does one man move massive quantities of heroin across borders, through ports, through military-adjacent infrastructure without protection? How does such an operation survive for years without institutional blindness, cooperation, or manipulation? These are the questions Hollywood never asks, because answering them would collapse the narrative of individual genius. This video begins where the movie ends. It strips away the cinematic framing and examines Frank Lucas not as a mastermind, but as a node inside a much larger system. A system that included corrupt law enforcement, disposable middlemen, and structures that decided when to tolerate him and when to destroy him. The dark truth is not that Frank Lucas was too powerful, but that he was powerful only as long as the system found him convenient. By the end of this story, the legend of the American Gangster will look less like a triumph of criminal intelligence and more like a warning about how easily Hollywood can turn a single cog into a myth, while the machinery that truly mattered remains unseen. In American Gangster, Frank Lucas is framed as something rare and dangerous, a mastermind who didn't just sell drugs, but re-engineered the entire heroin business. The film presents him as a man with total control, someone who identified inefficiencies in the Mafia's supply chain and eliminated them with precision. He is shown sourcing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, bypassing Italian intermediaries, cutting costs, and flooding Harlem with a purer product at a lower price. This version of Lucas is calm, calculating, and always one step ahead, a figure who turns logistics into dominance and strategy into myth. What makes this portrayal so convincing is how neatly it fits a familiar narrative. Hollywood loves the idea of the self-made outsider, the individual who sees what others cannot and breaks a closed system through intelligence alone. In this telling, the Mafia represents outdated power, rigid and arrogant, while Frank Lucas represents modern efficiency. He doesn't rely on tradition or bloodlines. He relies on data, discipline, and direct access. The implication is clear. He wins because he is smarter, not because the system allows him to. The movie reinforces this myth visually and narratively. Lucas is shown inspecting product quality, enforcing strict rules, and punishing internal corruption, all signs of a leader who supposedly controls every link in the chain. Law enforcement appears slow, reactive, and fragmented, always chasing a shadow that stays just out of reach. Even when pressure mounts, the story suggests that Lucas's downfall comes from overconfidence, from becoming too visible, not from structural weakness. His empire feels personal, almost artisanal, as if it could only have been built by him. But this image depends on a critical assumption, that such an operation could exist independently. The film asks the audience to believe that a single man, no matter how disciplined, could manage international supply, transport, distribution, money laundering, and protection, all while operating inside one of the most heavily policed cities in the world. By focusing on Lucas's intelligence, the movie quietly removes every other actor from the frame. Corrupt officials become background noise. Complicit systems become invisible. What remains is a hero-sized criminal who seems to bend reality through willpower alone. This is where myth replaces logic. By turning Frank Lucas into the center of gravity, the story transforms a networked crime economy into a one-man operation. It invites admiration for efficiency while discouraging questions about permission, tolerance, and systemic failure. The result is a legend that feels empowering but misleading. A narrative where control appears absolute and consequences feel optional. And once that legend is accepted, the darker truth becomes harder to see: that no criminal empire of this scale survives on intelligence alone, and that the appearance of total control often masks a deeper dependence on forces far larger than any single man. The real Frank Lucas did not operate as a solitary genius standing above the system. He operated inside it, surrounded by forces that were larger, older, and far more powerful than he was. Unlike the movie version, which suggests independence, the historical reality shows a man whose rise depended on permission, protection, and constant negotiation. Every major advantage attributed to Lucas required cooperation from others who remained safely out of frame. Without those relationships, the operation could not have existed, let alone expanded. Lucas did not personally control international logistics. He relied on suppliers, transporters, handlers, and local distributors, each with their own interests and leverage. These were not loyal subordinates bound by ideology. They were transactional actors who stayed involved as long as the risk-reward balance favored them. The moment that balance shifted, loyalty evaporated. What Hollywood portrays as discipline was, in reality, a fragile web of mutual convenience, constantly threatened by greed, fear, and betrayal. Lucas's authority existed only as long as others found it useful. More importantly, his survival in New York City depended on law enforcement tolerance. Large-scale heroin distribution cannot function under relentless scrutiny. It requires gaps in enforcement, selective blindness, and, in some cases, active corruption. Officers, supervisors, and intermediaries benefited quietly while maintaining plausible deniability. This did not mean the entire system was corrupt, but it meant enough of it was compromised to create breathing room. Lucas did not defeat the police. He operated in spaces the police chose not to fully close. The myth also exaggerates Lucas's dominance over the Mafia. While he did disrupt traditional channels, he did not replace them wholesale. Italian organized crime families still controlled territory, labor, and protection rackets that Lucas needed to avoid or accommodate. Conflict was managed through understanding, not conquest. The image of a lone, black gangster humiliating entrenched power structures simplifies a far messier reality where coexistence mattered more than victory. Perhaps the most misleading aspect of the myth is the idea that Lucas controlled his fate. In reality, he was constantly exposed. Every shipment created new risk. Every expansion increased visibility. And every partner introduced another point of failure. Lucas did not sit above the system pulling strings. He stood in the middle, absorbing pressure from all sides. His confidence masked vulnerability, and his success depended on conditions he did not create and could not sustain indefinitely. This reframing matters because it changes how we understand power. Frank Lucas was not a mastermind bending institutions to his will. He was a temporary beneficiary of institutional weakness. His rise was less about brilliance and more about timing, tolerance, and the willingness of others to look away. Once those conditions shifted, The myth of control collapsed quickly. And that collapse reveals the darker truth Hollywood avoids. In complex criminal economies, visibility is not power. It is exposure. Hollywood's most provocative claim about Frank Lucas is also the one that demands the most scrutiny. The idea that he personally engineered a heroin pipeline from Vietnam to Harlem, exploiting wartime chaos and military transport to move product at an industrial scale. The image is powerful. A lone operator threading narcotics through a global conflict, outsmarting institutions designed to prevent exactly that. But once the spectacle fades, logic intrudes. Wars do not create open lanes for independent criminals. They create layers of control, checks, and gatekeepers. The notion of a single man mastering that environment misunderstands how power actually flows during conflict. Consider the mechanics. Wartime logistics are not informal. Aircraft, ports, and cargo routes are governed by military protocols, customs oversight, and command hierarchies. Movement happens because multiple approvals align, not because one individual is clever. For heroin to travel consistently across borders during a war, it must pass through spaces where inspections can be delayed, redirected, or ignored. That does not happen by accident. It requires tolerance, corruption, or delegated blindness at several points along the chain. The movie suggests mastery. The reality points to permission. This is where the illusion of control becomes most dangerous. By focusing on Lucas's supposed ingenuity, the narrative erases the intermediaries who made continuity possible. Fixers who smoothed transfers, brokers who managed risk, local enforcers who ensured distribution stayed quiet. None of these roles belong to a lone mastermind. They belong to a system that can absorb losses and keep moving. Lucas did not invent that system. He occupied a position within it that was visible enough to seem central, but replaceable enough to be removed when pressure rose. The Vietnam backdrop also functions as a narrative shield. It invites the audience to attribute success to chaos, war as cover, distance as protection. But war tightens control where it matters most. The spaces that remain porous do so because someone with authority allows them to be. The uncomfortable implication is not that Lucas was uniquely brilliant, but that his operation aligned with interests that preferred quiet continuity over disruption. When that alignment held, the pipeline flowed. When it broke, the story ended. What Hollywood frames as daring innovation is better understood as operational fit. Lucas's methods worked because they matched existing vulnerabilities: overextended oversight, fragmented accountability, and incentives misaligned by money. That fit created the appearance of mastery, but mastery implies authorship. In reality, authorship belonged to a broader arrangement that could function with or without him. This reframing clarifies the darkness at the heart of the myth. Frank Lucas did not conquer wartime logistics. He benefited from them. His success did not prove that individuals can outthink institutions. It proved that institutions under strain can be quietly bent. The illusion of mastery is comforting because it simplifies blame. The truth is harder. When systems fail, they do so collectively, and they choose their scapegoats only after the damage is done. The collapse of Frank Lucas did not come from a sudden moral awakening or a brilliant police breakthrough. It came from betrayal, layered and inevitable, the kind that follows once a system decides a man has become expendable. Hollywood prefers the image of a king undone by arrogance, but the reality is colder. Lucas fell because the conditions that tolerated him changed, and when they did, every relationship he relied on quietly reversed direction. At the center of this reversal were the very networks that once shielded him. Partners who had profited from stability now saw danger. Handlers who had smoothed operations sensed scrutiny rising. Law enforcement figures who had benefited from selective blindness faced political pressure that made continued tolerance risky. None of these actors owed Lucas loyalty. Their allegiance was always to self-preservation, not to a man or a myth. When the risk-reward equation flipped, protection turned into exposure. This is where the system shows its true design. It does not collapse when one figure is removed, it rebalances. Investigations narrowed. Information flowed in the right direction. Surveillance focused where it would be most effective. Lucas did not suddenly become careless. He became convenient. The same channels that once buffered him now delivered him. What looks like a betrayal by individuals was, in fact, a coordinated realignment by a system intent on protecting itself. The narrative of a heroic detective versus a criminal mastermind obscures this process. Enforcement did not need to dismantle the entire network. It needed a symbolic center, a visible operator whose removal could restore public confidence without triggering deeper inquiries. Lucas fit that role perfectly. He was prominent enough to satisfy headlines and isolated enough to be sacrificed without destabilizing the broader structure. This is why his arrest felt decisive while the market adapted almost immediately. Betrayal also came from within. Associates turned informant not out of loyalty to justice, but because incentives shifted. Deals were offered, sentences were mitigated. Silence was traded for survival. This was not chaos, it was transactional clarity. The system rewarded cooperation that narrowed responsibility upward to a single name, while dispersing accountability outward into obscurity. Lucas's myth made him the perfect endpoint for blame. What Hollywood frames as downfall through hubris is better understood as withdrawal of tolerance. As long as Lucas aligned with institutional convenience, he remained buffered. Once pressure mounted, from media attention, political demands, or internal recalibration, his protection evaporated. The speed of that evaporation reveals the truth the legend hides. Power was never his to lose. It was borrowed, conditional, and revocable. This chapter matters because it exposes the mechanics of collapse in complex criminal economies. Individuals fall not when they make mistakes, but when they become liabilities. Betrayal is not an anomaly, it is the mechanism. And when the system no longer needs a man, it does not negotiate. It replaces him, quietly, efficiently, and without consequence to itself. When Frank Lucas finally stood exposed, the legend unraveled faster than anyone expected. Hollywood presents this moment as the dramatic fall of a towering figure, a king brought down by his own excess. The reality was far less theatrical. Lucas was not removed because he was uniquely dangerous or irreplaceable. He was removed because he had become visible, and visibility is the one thing complex systems cannot tolerate for long. Once he crossed that threshold, the machinery that once absorbed him shifted to erase him. The most revealing detail of Lucas's downfall is what did not happen. The heroin economy did not collapse. Distribution did not stop. New operators did not scramble blindly. Instead, the network adjusted. Routes changed. Names disappeared. Operations resumed under different faces. This continuity exposes the core illusion at the heart of the myth. Lucas was never the center of gravity. He was a focal point, important enough to matter, but not essential enough to protect. When he fell, the system demonstrated its resilience by continuing without him. His cooperation with authorities further underscores this reality. Lucas did not transform into a moral actor. He adapted to the incentives offered. Reduced sentences, protection, and survival became bargaining chips. By the time he testified, the mythology of the untouchable mastermind was already dead. All what remained was a man navigating the same transactional logic that had governed his rise. Cooperation was not betrayal of a kingdom. It was the final acknowledgement that there had never been one to begin with. Hollywood often frames this phase as redemption or reckoning. The truth is more uncomfortable. Lucas's removal served a purpose beyond punishment. It closed a narrative. It allowed institutions to claim success without confronting the broader failures that enabled the operation in the first place. By focusing accountability on a single individual, the system insulated itself from scrutiny. The myth made this possible. It simplified a network into a name and then erased the name. In the end, Frank Lucas did not lose a throne. He lost a function. Once that function was no longer needed, he became a disposable asset. This is the darkest aspect of the story, not the crimes themselves, but the ease with which a man can be elevated by a system and discarded by the same forces without altering the conditions that produced him. This final contrast completes the arc from myth to reality. The American Gangster was never a solitary genius conquering the underworld. He was a temporary beneficiary of structural weakness, a visible node in a hidden economy. His fall does not prove the system works. It proves the system knows exactly when to sacrifice an individual to preserve itself. The story of Frank Lucas survives not because it explains reality, but because it simplifies it. By turning a complex criminal economy into the tale of a single mastermind, Hollywood gives audiences a villain they can understand and a narrative that feels complete. The problem is not admiration or condemnation, it is distraction. When we focus on the legend of the American Gangster, we stop asking how such operations functioned for years inside one of the most heavily policed cities in the world, and why they were tolerated until they became inconvenient. The real danger of this myth is that it shifts responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. Frank Lucas did not design the environment that allowed him to thrive. He operated within it, benefiting from institutional blindness, selective enforcement, and transactional alliances that were never meant to last. When pressure mounted, those same structures closed ranks and presented him as the problem solved. The machinery remained intact, untouched by the story's ending. This is why the contrast between myth and reality matters. Lucas's rise does not prove that criminal genius can defeat the state. His fall does not prove that justice ultimately prevails. Together, they reveal something far more unsettling. Power is rarely where it appears to be. It moves through systems, incentives, and decisions made far from the spotlight. Individuals become symbols only when they are useful, and they disappear when the narrative demands closure. By stripping away the cinematic framing, this story leaves us with a harder truth. Frank Lucas was not the exception. He was the example. An example of how easily a system can elevate a single figure into a legend, and how quickly it can discard that figure once the legend becomes a liability. Understanding that difference does not make the story less compelling. It makes it honest.